Hi, everyone. Thank you for putting your names and locations into the chat. It's fun to see we have an international audience joining us today. Welcome to Rainforest Action Network's webinar on our Banking on Climate Chaos report. My name is Zan Garland, and I'm RAND's Development Director. I'm located in Asheville, North Carolina, on the unceded land of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee. If you haven't yet, please put your name and location in the chat so we can get to know who's here. I see someone else from Asheville. And if you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should see a Q&A box where you can submit questions throughout the presentation. Our team members will moderate the questions at the end. We also have enabled closed captioning. At the bottom of your screen, you can enable captions as well. And if you have any issues with that or anything else, just put that in the chat or the Q&A box too. And we're also going to record and send a recording out after this webinar. To set the stage for today's conversation, I'd like to share a bit about what RAND does to provide you with some context for how the BOCC fits into how we fight for people and planet and how we achieve results. As you all know, fossil fuels and deforestation are two of the biggest drivers of climate change, and extracting and burning fossil fuels and destroying forests are often preceded by and leave behind catastrophic human rights violations. At RAND, we build people power to challenge corporate power, to keep forests standing, protect the climate, and uphold human rights. We're behind some of the biggest ways businesses change their practices to set new standards for their entire industry, like Disney moving away from using rainforest timber in their book publishing in 2012, affecting the entire publishing industry, and frequent incremental wins, like Chubb being the first North American insurer to set a policy to restrict future oil and gas projects in March of this year. How do we achieve these huge outcomes? We have a time-tested strategy using direct action, corporate engagement, collaborative partnerships with frontline and indigenous communities, and globally recognized cutting-edge research and reports. We hold some of the world's largest corporations accountable for forest destruction, loss of biodiversity, climate change, and the exploitation of indigenous peoples, local communities, and workers. Our Community Action Grants program is also a big part of our commitment to share resources with our partners and to build stronger movements. Just last year, the program dispersed $875,000 in small grants. And all of RAND's work is in partnership with other organizations and communities. I can't think of a single action or win we've accomplished without our network of dedicated and coordinated partners and supporters leveraging each other's strengths to make a huge impact. The Banking on Climate Chaos report is one of our biggest and most well-known reports, with thousands of media hits, hundreds of organizational endorsements, and a huge presence in the environmental movement to expose enablers of climate destruction and hold them accountable in a variety of ways. I'm excited for you to hear more from our speakers. Thank you for being a supporter of RAND and for joining us for this presentation. Today, you'll hear from Aditi Sen, April Merlot, and Ruth Breach in our Climate and Energy program. It's my pleasure to introduce Aditi, who joined RAND in 2022 to guide the overall strategy of the Climate and Energy team as their program director. Aditi brings a deep commitment to centering human rights and equity in climate action. She was previously at Oxfam, where she led corporate accountability and engagement efforts on climate issues and coordinated programs and policy advocacy on forests, land use, and land rights in the Global South. Aditi is author of several publications, including Tightening the Net Zero Climate Targets, Implications for Land and Food Equity. She is currently based in Washington, D.C. Aditi?
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today with all of you, and thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. So before we jump into the Banking on Climate Chaos report and the findings from this year's report, I wanted to give just a very quick overview of what the Climate and Energy program at RAND does. As Zan just mentioned, we are really focused on the biggest drivers of climate change, and we know that fossil fuels are one of the biggest drivers of climate change. In fact, the science couldn't be clearer. There is no room for new fossil fuel infrastructure, whether it's new coal, oil, gas, new LNG terminals, if we are to have a livable planet. In fact, we need to really double down on phasing down fossil fuels and scaling up a just energy transition. And so RAND's focus has really been on shifting private finance away from fossil fuels, because we know that money is a big enabler of the fossil fuel industry. Despite the overwhelming signs that fossil fuels are driving climate chaos, we see that big banks, big investors, big insurance companies are continuing to prop up the industry through massive amounts of funding and financing. And so our goal is to really shift that flow of money away from fossil fuels towards a just energy transition to help support a livable planet for all of us. And we do this in 3 ways. We run market sector campaigns, which are focused on the biggest banks and biggest insurance companies. As Zan just mentioned, we use a range of both inside-outside approaches. We use a lot of grassroots pressure, but we also engage companies on the inside. And our focus is not just on getting the banks and insurance companies to adopt strong climate policies, but we're also asking them to adopt strong human rights policies and policies to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, because we know that the impact of fossil fuel extractivism is disproportionately borne by frontline communities across the world. We also anchor our work in deep research and analysis, and the BOCC is an example of that research. And finally, all our work is really anchored in deep partnership with frontline communities, but with also a lot of other organizations in the space. So we really see RAND's work as being part of a broader movement to shift financing away from fossil fuels and to keep fossil fuels in the ground. This work has a really long legacy. While I joined RAND less than a year ago, this work originated at RAND in 2001 with an iconic campaign targeting Citibank. Next slide, please. So why is the Banking on Climate Chaos report so important? We see BOCC as really a foundational tool that allows campaigners and policymakers across the world to hold banks accountable for the financing they provide, both in the form of lending and underwriting to the fossil fuel industry. And we know that by providing the financing, banks are really providing the oxygen that enables fossil fuel companies to continue to burn the planet. And we see this as being a tool that's utilized in a number of different ways by different stakeholders and different audiences. Next slide, please. It is increasingly a critical tool for campaigners across the world to hold banks accountable. It is a resource for policymakers like Senator Elizabeth Warren or Senator Sheldon Whitehouse to hold banks accountable. It is a go-to resource in the media, and increasingly we are seeing a number of shareholders, particularly shareholders who are motivated by concerns of sustainability, use BOCC data. It also really provides a tool to continue to hold the banks accountable for their climate pledges. We see BOCC as really the receipts of and evidence of whether the banks are actually backing up their climate commitments with real cash. Over the last few years, we've seen a number of banks come up with very fairly lofty sounding climate pledges and net zero pledges. And this is an opportunity to really dig deep and see whether any of these pledges have real teeth or is it just greenwashing. And finally, the BOCC is a platform that brings together movement partners from across the world to call on banks to take real climate action. It is developed with a number of partners and it is endorsed by more than 600 organizations this year. And here are just a few examples of how we've used BOCC, how BOCC has been used just in 2023 alone. Earlier this year, one of our partners, Third Act, organized a massive day of action in major US cities to target the big banks, JP Morgan Chase, Citibank, Bank of America, and Wells Fargo. We saw some partners in France use BOCC data to bring a lawsuit against a French banking giant, BNP Paribas. With that, I wanted to introduce my amazing and brilliant colleague, April Merlot. April leads research at RAN. She has come to RAN from academia. She was a professor of history and environmental studies. The Banking on Climate Chaos report is a massive, massive project, and this project could not have been possible without her commitment and leadership. April, over to you.
Thanks so much, Aditi. I'm really glad to be here and to be sharing the results of this year's report with all of you. Thank you all so much for being here. It makes a huge difference for us. So as Aditi mentioned, the Banking Climate Chaos report is a collaborative project. We work with 6 other organizations, global organizations, to produce this report. It's a huge undertaking that we've done annually in some form or another for the last 14 years. Next slide. So a few kind of top line things to say about the report before I dig in and give you some details about the findings. So the first thing is that this is the most comprehensive analysis of private bank financing for fossil fuel companies. We cover 60 banks, the biggest banks globally by assets. We've got 7 authoring organizations. This year we have more than 600 endorsing organizations from 75 countries. We feature tables that highlight bank financing for all fossil fuels and then several spotlight sectors. I'll talk about that a little bit more. We include policy assessments to evaluate the policies that banks have set for themselves and hold them accountable. And we have online interactive data. In addition, we feature frontline stories from groups that are on the front lines of fossil fuel build out, fighting the really dangerous projects of extraction and expansion that we see globally. A couple new things this year we're really excited about include documentation of financing for companies expanding in the Amazon biome. We've got new frontline stories. We've got an extended essay on the build out of global build out of liquefied natural gas, which you'll hear about a little bit more later from my colleague Ruth. We've got an assessment of the net zero targets that banks have set. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. And we analyze financing for more than 3,000 fossil fuel companies. So the big takeaway here is that since the Paris Agreement went into effect in 2016, the 60 biggest banks have put $5.5 trillion into fossil fuels. So 7 years, $5.5 trillion into fossil fuels. And every dollar of that is driving climate chaos and causing deadly local community impacts for the frontline communities that are most impacted both by climate chaos and by the extraction. Slide, yeah. So I'm going to just say a few quick things about our methodology and what we do and don't include in the report. So the most important thing to say is that we cover in this report lending and underwriting activities by the bank. So when they issue a loan, when they participate in issuing a bond or supporting the issuing shares, that's what we count. We don't count their investments. So the actual, if they themselves and many of these banks do hold on to assets as investors and as asset managers, we don't look at that. So what we are looking at, that $5.5 trillion is actually even just a slice of the support that banks provide to fossil fuel companies. So that's something to keep in mind, is that we're just, even as big as it seems, it's still just a small piece of what we're looking at. Next slide. In addition to that big top line number, the $5.5 trillion in lending and underwriting, I can tell you a couple of the key takeaways from this year's report. So for the first time since 2019, when we started measuring all fossil fuels, a bank besides JP Morgan Chase ranks #1 as the worst financier of fossil fuels, and that's the Royal Bank of Canada, or RBC. JP Morgan Chase is still overall the worst bank since the Paris Agreement, having financed $434 billion to these fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement went into effect in 2016. But RBC and Canadian banks as a whole have been increasing their financing for fossil fuels and increasing their share of the overall table. So RBC provided $41 billion to fossil fuel companies in 2022, making for a total of $253 billion. Next slide. So the broader frame of this report is in part, of course, to share this data, to share these finance numbers and to share it in ways that are useful for campaigners and for advocates and just for people who are trying to understand where their banks are putting their money. The broader context is that this is all framed through the lens of Indigenous people's sovereignty and thinking about centering the voices of those who are on the front lines that are most directly impacted by fossil fuel build out and by the challenges of climate change. And we really see the framework of keeping it in the ground, right? Ending the extraction of fossil fuels and shifting towards a people-centered energy system as the core idea motivating this report. So we have a lengthy essay in this report from our partner, the Indigenous Environmental Network, that really highlights some of the false solutions that banks and other advocates are putting forward, and reiterates the idea that keeping fossil fuels in the ground is the way to address simultaneously the crisis of human rights and the crisis of climate. Next slide. So the largest banks, the largest financiers of fossil fuels since the Paris Agreement are JP Morgan Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, RBC, MUFG, which is a major Japanese bank. So there are 3 major Japanese banks that are in our list. 2 of them are in this top 12 list. And you'll notice about this list that US and Canadian banks dominate the list. We've got 1 British bank and 1 French bank and 1 Japanese bank, and otherwise we're looking at North American banks leading the way in the financing for fossil fuels. So those of you who are located in Canada or the United States, this is really, I think, a call to action for those of us living in those places. Next slide. So in addition to all fossil fuels, we track financing for companies that are operating in each of these particular sectors of the fossil fuel industry. So we look at financing for offshore oil and gas, Arctic oil and gas, fracked oil and gas, Amazon oil and gas exploration, coal power, coal mining, liquefied natural gas, tar sands oil, right? So we look at each of those separately and we adjust the transactions to reflect the percentage of the company's business that is in each of those sectors. So it gives us a little bit more fine-grained look at what the banks are doing and another tool to hold them accountable. Next slide. So I wanted to return to this, this slide for just a minute, because you might notice what looks like a little bit of a drop in 2022 in the total financing that banks provided to fossil fuel companies. And I wanted to just take a minute to explain what I think is going on there, because it doesn't actually make me feel particularly hopeful. I suspect that it's not the beginning of a long-term trend. The way that I've been describing it is that there was a slight drop in financing in 2020 for reasons that I think we're all familiar with, having to do with the COVID health crisis and a number of other kind of economic disruptions. There was a rebound in financing in 2021. And what I see happening in 2022 is a little bit more of a leveling out. And there are a couple of reasons why I think that happened. And the overall message is that it's not attributable to policies that the banks made. In other words, banks didn't make a proactive decision to stop financing fossil fuels last year, but instead broader market forces brought that number down a little bit, and I anticipate that it will go up again this year. Next slide. So the first factor contributing to that slight drop is just record fossil fuel profits, right? So I love this headline from The Guardian that refers to it as monster profits for energy giants. So we see, just following on years of either not particularly profitable years or actually years with losses, we see record profits in 2022. And that is, of course, having to do with the conflict in the Ukraine, Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, and disruptions to the global energy markets as a result of that. So those profits really are, I think in many ways, and some of the banks seem to agree with us about this, that those profits are driving the decisions the fossil fuel companies are making about how much they're going to borrow. They have cash on hand, so they're using that cash to finance their activities, to finance their expansion. And I suspect that this year, as the profits are not going to be as great this year, they're going to come back to the banks asking to borrow money again. Next slide. So we document this in a couple of ways in the report. One way is just looking at some of the really, really high profits from a couple of the fossil fuel companies that historically have been really big customers of the banks in our report. So the first example here is Occidental Petroleum Company, which made an increase of 721% in their profits between 21 and 22. So huge increase in profits from 21 to 22. And they have typically borrowed about $11 billion per year. Yeah, so they've borrowed a pretty huge amount every year and then borrowed nothing last year, right? So, and that we have a long list of these companies that have just record profits last year and didn't, as a result of that, didn't borrow anything. We also see some of these companies rolling back the already weak climate commitments that they had made. So this is just generally, I think, not great news. Next slide. Yeah, and we can skip over this because this is just a sort of bigger picture. So the second factor that I think contributed to the slight decrease in financing that banks provided to fossil fuels actually has to do with what the oil and gas industry themselves are doing. So this chart is in our report, and it draws on data analysis done by Oil Change International, another partnering organization that co-authors this report. So they created this chart using data from Rystad Energy, which is an industry database that tracks investments in a whole range of different kinds of oil and gas projects, and makes estimates about where production is going, where investments are going. So according to Rystad Energy, the amount of oil and gas that will be approved for development decreased in 2022 from 2021, and to the next to 2020, it's the lowest level since the Paris Agreement went into effect. And so because of that decrease, that estimated decrease in 2022, it stands to reason that bank financing for fossil fuel companies also might have decreased, because the bank financing tends to mirror the activity in the sector. By that same logic, they're estimating that the oil and gas reserves approved for development are going to increase by 2024 to the all-time high since 2015. So in terms of billions of barrels of oil equivalent that is going to come to a final investment decision, we're looking at a pretty dramatic increase over the next couple of years. And I'm anticipating that we're going to see an increase in bank financing for fossil fuels that parallels that. Next slide. In addition to looking at the finance data, we also do an analysis of bank policies. So we look at that banks make a couple of different kinds of policies in order to set the direction of travel for their fossil fuel financing. So one kind of policies are the kind that we call exclusion policies, where they say they're going to exclude financing for particular sectors. And we see a growing number of banks making policies like that for particularly dirty and difficult sectors like coal, for example. Unfortunately, for that kind of policy, we see many, many loopholes. And so it comes away seeming like more like greenwash than actual intention to be making a change in their business as usual. The other kind of policies that we see banks setting increasingly are net zero targets. So that means that they are announcing that they will align their financing with a global goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions, usually by 2050. Sometimes they have a slightly different time frame for that. Often we see that those targets are just not very strong. They've got lots of loopholes in them. They rely on untested and unproven technologies, rely on offsets that we know have a lot of problems, including human rights violations. So we don't have a whole lot of confidence in those net zero targets based on the analysis we did this year. Next slide. So just to give an example of one of the kinds of loopholes, one distinction that many of these policies make is that they apply only to a particular kind of financing, which is called project finance. So that's where the bank and the company that's seeking financing will structure a particular kind of deal that applies, that's financing a specific project. Unfortunately, and most of the bank's policies apply just to project finance. So they say if a company comes to us, let's just say ConocoPhillips, for example, if ConocoPhillips comes to us and says, we want to finance the Willow project, which is extracting oil from the Arctic, many of the banks in our report, not all of them, but many of them will say, no, we're not going to finance that project because it's in the Arctic and we are not financing projects in the Arctic. That kind of finance, project finance, only makes up 4% of the financing we see in our data set. The vast majority of financing we see is designated for general corporate purposes. So to use the ConocoPhillips example again, if ConocoPhillips goes to the bank and says, we would like to have a loan for general corporate purposes, just to carry on our business, that activity is not covered by most banks' Arctic policies. So in fact, what we saw last year, that ConocoPhillips, which is developing the Willow project that recently was approved by the Biden administration, ConocoPhillips got financing from the banks in our report last year, designated for general corporate purposes. And the banks say to us, well, we can't really tell exactly what they're going to do. We don't know for sure that that money is going to go to that particular project. And so we can't really exclude financing. But that's a huge loophole that really enables companies like ConocoPhillips to keep developing these really dangerous projects that are going to release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. Next slide. So in addition, we looked at the net zero commitments that the banks made. So their pledges to reach net zero for their own operations and also for to hold their clients accountable to reaching net zero by 2050. So 49 banks in the scope of the report made commitments like that. Just to showcase the ways that those commitments seem like they really lack, like they're just not that credible. $122 billion from those 49 banks went to the top 100 companies financing fossil fuel expansion in 2022. So we tracked $150 billion total that went to those 100 companies. 122 billion of that came from banks with net zero commitments. And even Antonio Guterres, who is the head of the UN, says that these bogus net zero pledges are being used to cover up massive fossil fuel expansion. And he calls on companies to stop using them as greenwash. Next slide. And this, I don't want to spend a lot of time in the interest of time on this chart, but this is really just to make the point why we talk a lot about expansion of fossil fuels, because we know that even just with the oil and gas reserves that have already been developed, if we burned all of that oil and gas, we already would exceed the carbon budget that we have to stay under 1.5 degrees of global warming. And so since we already have developed reserves that would take us past 1.5, we can't afford anything else to be developed, right? So anything that's undeveloped can't move into that category of developed if we have any chance of staying under 1.5 degrees, which is one of the reasons why we focus on expansion in this report and in the conversations we have with banks. Next slide. So as I wrap up, and then I'm going to hand off to my colleague Ruth, I just want to point out that this data is all available on our website. And this is really one of the goals of the report, is to have the data be accessible to as many campaigners, people on the ground fighting fossil fuel build out, and to just make it like really easily accessible. So our website is bankingonclimatechaos.org. You can jump down to the Explore the Data panel, and it gives you a couple different ways to look at the financing that banks have provided to individual companies, look at it by sector, look at it by year. There are tables that you can download in order to explore that data yourself. There are a couple of different interactives. Next slide. And in addition, there are interactives to look at the bank's policies. So you can click through get details about their particular policies, how they apply, and a policy score that was developed by our partners at Reclaim Finance, another contributor to this report. And you can also see links there directly to the bank's policy documents, so you can see how they describe it themselves. Next slide. And so finally, just want to point out that in addition to those other interactives, we've got this beautiful interactive map that highlights stories from the front lines of groups that are fighting fossil fuel build out. So you can see brief profiles, links to further information about them, and learn more about them. So with that, I'm gonna hand things off to Ruth Breach, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of what's going on with liquefied natural gas and frontline groups there. So it is really my pleasure to introduce Ruth, who is a senior campaigner on the climate and energy team. She is responsible for organizing the corporate accountability campaigns. She works closely with frontline communities that are fighting fossil fuels. She supports direct actions and grassroots support networks across the country. And she brings over 20 years of experience to this work in environmental and climate justice. Really so happy for her to be sharing with you. Ruth?
Awesome. Thanks so much for that, April. That is such a wealth of information, and just also deeply appreciating your consistent leadership in bringing the Banking on Climate Chaos to life this year. Really great information. So as April mentioned, and you heard from April on each of the data sets, it represents a deep impact on frontline communities. One concerning trend is the increase in bank financing for liquefied natural gas. What you see on this slide is the top bankers. As April mentioned earlier, this is a Japanese bank, Mizuho. Morgan Stanley is Wall Street in the US, JP Morgan Chase. So these are top bankers internationally this year as of 2022. And then these are since the Paris Agreement. Some of you may be familiar with liquefied natural gas and that you know that it is nothing natural about it. It's composed mostly of methane gas, which is more than 25 times as potent as carbon dioxide at trapping heat in the atmosphere. Methane gas export and import is the largest fossil fuel buildout of our generation. This buildout could lock us into decades more dependent on fossil fuels. There are over 20 export terminals proposed in the US Gulf Coast alone. We're going to share a short video with you, and I'd like to introduce some of the leaders from the Gulf South, including James Hyatt with For a Better Bayou and Rashida Ozain with the Vessel Project. These people have been instrumental in leading the work in ending fossil fuel expansion in the Gulf Coast, and I've worked closely with them and grateful to share their voices with you today.
Yeah, it really makes you wonder, like, why are they wanting to put them right here? And I think the answer is that they think that we don't care. They think that people are disposable, dispensable.
We just feel like, you know, we've been made into a sacrifice. The people who are funding this crisis and funding these industry are the very banks that we put our money in. And so banks such as Bank of America and JP Morgan and Citibank, those banks are the banks that are giving money to the industry so that they can build these projects here.
If we don't do anything, we know what the future looks like.
The clock is ticking. It's now been 6 years since the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted, but a report from 6 NGOs called Banking on Climate Chaos found that in that time, the 60 biggest private banks in the world have financed $3.8 trillion in fossil fuels. Campaigners say that money has funded projects which have consequences for communities around the world.
So no new fossil fuel production starting today. That's like zero. Does your bank have a policy against funding new oil and gas products? Mr. Diamond?
Absolutely not.
Thanks, Danny. From the front lines of the fossil fuel expansion, like you heard from Roishetta and James in the Gulf Coast, to the bank league tables that April walked us through, we've formulated this demand set in coalition with our partners, and then also with the movement in mind of thinking about global and local impacts. And through here, our conclusion that we were sending to each of the banks as they get a copy of the report, both before the production goes out and engagement throughout. We believe that banks must align their financing with a 1.5 degree pathway and enable a fair and just transition. And to do so, that means prohibiting all finance for fossil fuel expansion immediately. You heard Rashida Tlaib press Jamie Dimon on that in Congress. We must adopt absolute finance emission reduction targets. So no more greenwashing. We need real reductions in emissions. We must demand robust transition plans for all existing fossil fuel clients. So that means all clients, including the Exxons and the Shells that have these, continued relationships with the banks. We must protect the rights of Indigenous peoples and human rights, and absolutely scale up financing for a just and fair transition. And thanks so much. This is the end of our presentation here, and we wanted to open it up for some questions, and I'm just going to start a few off. We'll have more of a panel style with Aditi, April, and myself. And I'm going to kick us off with sending one over to Aditi. Aditi, how has the climate and energy team strategy shifted over the 14-year report trajectory, and what's next?
Yeah, thanks, Drew. Thanks for that question. So I'm new to RAN myself, but I know, having spoken to a number of people over the last year and also sort of having seen the reports come out myself, that it has evolved over the last few years, and it has evolved in many ways, recognizing that the climate crisis has evolved. We are seeing the impacts of climate crisis intensify. It is no longer a problem that's out there in the distant future. It is here and now. And so there are a few shifts that have happened over this time frame. When the work initially started out, it focused on what was known as extreme fossil fuels, or really problematic fossil fuels like coal and tar sands. And now there's a recognition that actually all fossil fuels are problematic, even the so-called liquefied natural gas, when there's nothing natural about them here, is also really problematic. And so we are looking at all fossil fuels, and we are looking at fossil fuels in the context of climate science and the need to limit warming to below 1.5 C. The other sort of shift that has happened is that initially when this started out, the focus was on a few specific banks, but now our campaigns are looking at the Wall Street banks as a pack, because they typically move in a bank, in a pack, but also looking at the banks more holistically, both in terms of the financing, but also looking at banks' policies across different sectors. And April walked you through some of that analysis. The other shift that's happened is that we are recognizing that the climate crisis is not just about emissions, it is about human beings, it is about people who are impacted, and it is an intersectional crisis. We cannot solve the climate crisis unless we address the issues of human rights. And so we are really centering frontline stories and frontline impacts in our work. And finally, I think, over the course of the last decade or so, the climate finance movement has really grown, and we've seen a number of new groups and a number of partners come into the space, and that's really great to see. Ultimately, it is going to take a movement and a movement of movement and collective people power to really challenge the corporate power that we're up against. But we know that when people fight, we win. So we're excited about how this movement has grown over the last decade. I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Aditi. April, I have a two-part question from you. One that we get a lot, and then one from John Powers in the chat. So the first part of this question is, what is the significance of a Canadian bank being the largest fossil funder this past year? And then the second part of the question, is there organized support for the shareholder initiative at RBC?
Yeah, thanks. Those are great questions. Super interesting that RBC is ranked as the worst financier this year. I think in some ways we might not have predicted it given how committed to fossil fuels JP Morgan Chase seems to be, and how much more cumulatively they've provided to fossil fuel companies since 2016 than other banks. And we do see that Canadian banks as a whole are increasing their financing to fossil fuels in this last year, even as the trend seemed like it was that fossil fuel financing is going down slightly. And some, particularly our partners that are campaigning around the Canadian banks, really are seeing the Canadian banks starting to be like the lenders of last resort. So particularly for fossil fuel companies that are having trouble finding financing in other places. Some of the European banks have more rigorous policies, and Canadian banks don't seem to be stepping up to the plate. The other piece, I think, is just that fossil fuels are actually central in some ways to the Canadian economy. And so the Canadian banks have been somewhat hesitant, I think, to step back from them. And that signals a real issue, I think, because the Canadian economy really, I think Canadians deserve to have an economy that shifts away from fossil fuels, because that's just increasingly untenable. It's not a stable economic base going into the future. And so Canadian banks have a real opportunity to foster that shift, and they just aren't. So yeah, the Canadian banks had their shareholder meetings at the end of March and the beginning of April. Most of those Canadian banks had shareholder meetings then, and we saw a really tremendous outpouring of activism and pressure around those shareholder meetings. Ruth might also be able to talk a little bit about this. They're the hereditary chiefs from the Wet'suwet'en attempted to attend Royal Bank RBC's meeting, shareholder meeting, and were turned away in a really disrespectful way. So RBC really, I think, drawing a line about where they stand, and not seeing them move in the right direction. So a couple of groups that are campaigning really tightly focused on that. Stand.Earth is one group that has taken a lot of leadership, and I think Ruth might be able to talk about some other groups. But thanks for those questions.
Yeah, I think April, you hit the nail right on the head, but there's an incredible movement that's been growing, in particular in Canada on RBC, in particular, and TD. That is Stand. It's been the Wet'suwet'en land defense. There's a solidarity network that shows up at bank branches every day. There's a youth movement amongst college students. So it's really, really been growing. So there is a lot. And they also had a couple of resolutions as well as the US banks this year. And there's a really strong North American network that's been working together on every aspect of that bank financing, from the shareholders to the street actions. Awesome. So just to get through a few more questions here, seeing them come in both in the chat and on the Q&A. I'm going to pass it back to you, April. And then Aditi, also, if you want to jump in here, do you have any dialogue? This is from Helene in the chat. Do you have any dialogue with banks on this report? Do they reject the report, defend themselves? They're obviously not changing their behavior.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually one of the really fun pieces. Actually, the whole report's fun. But one of the really fun things is that we do a lot of engagement with the banks around the report, both in the lead up to the report and afterwards. So the report, definitely, we've got the banks' attention, many of them at least. I would say probably about half of the banks actively engage with us. So there are a couple of rounds. We send them emails early in the process. So like in January, when we're really beginning to compile the report, there's engagement to make sure that we've got the most up-to-date policies that they've issued that we're analyzing. We offer them the chance to review the data, so the deals that we're attributing to them. And that is actually a really fruitful part of the process, because those banks, again, probably a third of the banks actually take the opportunity to review their data. And we often get really useful feedback from them that I think just makes the data much stronger. And So yeah, there are definitely a couple of banks that just flat out reject it. That has been RBC's strategy this year in response to the negative press they've gotten from the headlines. They've really dismissed the report. But other banks, I think, really take it seriously and certainly take seriously the activism that the that the report enables. So I think they see it as a threat, which I think is actually a good sign, because it encourages them to step up what they're doing internally. And we have seen an increase, even if it's not making an impact yet. They definitely are putting more resources into, at least into dealing with us and other organizations that are asking them to do this work. And one sign I think that it's making an impact is that our methodology that we use to develop this report has been adopted by the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a kind of industry organization. And they've used this methodology to produce a slightly different kind of report. But it's entered the mainstream. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks, April. We're actually going to come back to that in a minute or two. And then Aditi, I'm going to combine a couple of the questions that just kind of are similar in the chat. This one is from Lynn. Can we ask our investment advisors to rid our portfolio of the worst bank actors? So that's the first part of the question. And then I know we get this a lot too here at RAND. And what can an average person, an American, do to make a small but hopeful, doable movement that they can share in a simple way to share with others? Is there a bank that we should use instead of these banks that are supporting the fossil fuel companies?
Thanks, Ruth. So yeah, I think, at the end of the day, I think we all have a role to play, and we all can use our voice and agency to make a difference here. And it is going to take all of us to move these big banks. They are behemoths. There's definitely a huge role for investors and shareholders to play. So if you own shares in any of these banks, you can not only ask your portfolio manager to clean up your portfolio, but actually what you could do is really use the voice of your shares to demand to vote in the shareholder meetings. And the threshold for voting in the United States is one of the good things about it is that you do not actually have to hold shares worth like tens of millions of dollars. Even a small shareholding gives you the right to vote. And so you should definitely exercise your right to vote. Just earlier this year, and in fact, it's happening right now, a number of banks have had their annual shareholder meetings, and this is an opportunity to really use your voice as a shareholder. So whether it's through your portfolio management company or through the shares you yourself hold in these companies, you definitely have a voice and a vote, and I would urge you to exercise that vote. And then if we are not shareholders, most of us have bank accounts. So we are customers and clients. And so we can also use our voice and our agency as customers and clients to demand action from the banks. And sometimes it could be as simple as signing on a petition or showing up at your local branch to demand action alongside others in your community. And sometimes it could be considering moving your money or cutting your credit card. I know that it's not always easy to actually switch banks. There's a lot that goes into it. But there are alternatives out there. There are credit unions, there are small, mid-sized banks that do have fossil-free policies and standards. And so we definitely sort of encourage you to sort of think about alternatives, but there's an opportunity, but there are multiple ways in which as investors or as consumers and clients, we can use our voice and leverage to move the banks. And I think the bare minimum is, I think, just sort of demanding action collectively and showing up at these banks and using our voice to call out the banks, but also to call out the governments to regulate the banks, because at the end of the day, without regulation, we know that the banks are not, they're not beholden to any law. So I think we need strong regulation as well. So just to say that there are multiple ways we all can be part of this fight.
Thanks for that, Aditi. And also a reminder, we're part of an incredibly huge and beautiful movement. We're a coalition member of Stop the Money Pipeline, where there's artwork, there's music, there's literally different things that people can do every single day to get involved. I think Aditi summed that up well. We're going to bounce around just a little bit. I think we have about 3 more questions to kind of answer here. Going back to you, April, do you have a list of banks that have financed green energy sources and their specific investments?
That's a great question, and one that we've been getting a lot more. In fact, I just answered that question by email earlier today. So yeah, definitely a great question. So we are not tracking that right now. It's a kind of open question whether that's something we begin to track, but there are other groups that are doing it. When I just mentioned the Bloomberg New Energy Finance a minute ago, and they the research that they've developed is actually looking at the ratio between fossil fuel financing and financing for what they call clean energy. And we have issue with some of how they define clean energy because they include things that we see as really false solutions in that definition. But it does at least give some indication of which banks are following through on commitments. Because in fact, many of the banks that we're looking at, one of their responses is, well, we don't want to stop financing fossil fuels because we still need them for a while, but we're going to increase our financing to clean energy sources. And we just don't see them moving fast enough. They just need to be moving a lot faster on that. And even the Bloomberg New Energy Finance, which is a kind of industry-friendly research organization, even they agree that banks are not moving fast enough to fund the energy transition that we need. Other groups are looking at that includes Sunrise. The Sunrise Project has commissioned some research related to that. And yeah, but so I would say Bloomberg at the moment, Bloomberg is the best. And if you look at Bloomberg News, sometimes there's tracking on that. Yeah, those are the sort of the best sources right now for information about financing for the transition.
Thanks, April. And then just a couple more maybe to you, Aditi, to kind of start to wrap up here. Liz is from an anonymous attendee in the questions. How does RAND ensure that your reports get to and are read by key legislative and policy decision makers? Is there a way to track this?
Yeah, thanks. You know, part of the value that we see in the BOCC report is not just in the actual sort of analysis and the findings, but also ensuring that it gets used by as many stakeholders and audiences as possible. So we put in a lot of effort into outreach, and we work with different partners. One of the partners we work with is Sierra Club, and they do a lot of outreach to folks on the Hill, and there will, people correct me if I'm wrong, but there will be a briefing on the Hill as well at some point for BOCC that Sierra Club's organizing.
Yes, that is accurate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
About tracking, I'm not 100% sure, to be honest, how well we track our outreach to policymakers, and that's a really good point. So definitely noting that we are tracking media outreach quite a bit, and we also track all the various organizations who use this report. But we probably need to get a bit better at sort of tracking our outreach to policymakers. But we do make a consent this report to policymakers who we know are interested in ensuring more accountability from the banks.
Yeah, thanks for that, Aditi. And then I just wanted, there's a few questions coming in from Glenn, and just wanted to address a few of these. Glenn Risden, there was a question about the total release of the Nord Stream, I believe, pipeline explosion. And so we have not been involved in that work, but one of the ways that the BOCC, the Banking on Climate Chaos report, can be used is you can go into the database that April mentioned, right on the website, and you can see who the financiers of that project are. And we're also doing a lot of work around energy security since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's been a huge issue and kind of propping up LNG. So just wanted to let you know that there's resources, even if this isn't kind of a main project of RAND, you can be doing your work and this can be supplementing and supporting your work. And then there's another piece around insurance companies. We have an incredible insurance program. I don't know, Aditi, if you want to touch on that briefly.
Yeah, so we have two main programs or campaign areas in this program. One is focused on banks and the other is focused on insurance, and we see LNG as sort of a focus area across the two. The insurance program started, I would say, around 5 years ago, and it's been, you know, we see insurance as being a really key lever because most fossil fuel projects need funding, they need insurance, and they need permits. And so stopping the flow of insurance can actually be a really significant lever. In the context of the insurance program, we have been focusing again on the big US insurers, in particular Liberty Mutual and Chubb. And we've actually seen some significant movement from Chubb policies around insuring oil and gas. It's obviously not perfect, and there's still lots of loopholes that can enable expansion, but we definitely see insurance as being a really critical area for us and are focused on that as part of this program.
Thanks so much, Aditi. So just to kind of, we're going to wrap up here. And I think we had one question that came through to the hosts and panelists, and just like an important one. And I realize we also have a couple process questions. So we'll work to get those answered for you. I think Emily is going to support that process. But one of the questions that folks have had is about like good banks and bad banks. So again, remember, we're looking at the 60 largest banks. A lot of the kind of like smaller and regional banks are not included in this because they wouldn't reach the threshold of funding something like an Exxon. And then also there's a lot of stuff that's happening right now with the mid-sized banks. For instance, First Republic, who was one of the first fossil-free banks to sign a pledge about not financing fossil fuels, has now been gobbled up by JP Morgan Chase. So there's a lot of things that we're trying to figure out right now as giants are kind of taking on. So similar in Switzerland with UBS and Credit Suisse, like what are the actual ramifications of what their fossil fuel financing is? What are the commitments of First Republic? So we're very deeply grappling with those right now. And we understand that some of these like smaller mid-sized banks and even the credit unions aren't going to have the services that you may need if you're a high net worth individual or if you own a business, things like that. So we're constantly working with an incredible network of people to really build out those alternatives. There's networks that are happening in California around public banking, tribes owning their own banks. So there's a lot of innovative work that's happening here. So I would say stay with us through this and really appreciating kind of your commitment to finding that right institution that is values aligned. Check.
Thank you all so much for coming to this presentation this afternoon. I continue to learn a lot from my colleagues and just loved hearing their presentations. And I was blown away by the level of engagement that you brought today with all of your questions. So I know we didn't get to every single question. My email is Zanne, Z-A-N-N-E @rand.org. Emily put her email in the chat. She and I do not know all these answers, but we will help find them for you. So if you have questions that didn't get answered, please reach out to us directly. Thanks again to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for your support of RAN. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, folks.
Thanks, everyone.